And this is the week, of course, when we celebrate, according to the email I got from the Conservative Party, Brexit. Happy Brexit Day was the message they sent me, which I deleted. Well, I think, you know, sometimes in politics you have to make a distinction between what's popular and what's credible and what builds credibility over a period of time. So if you say, should bankers receive uncapped bonuses, most people in the country are going to go, no, of course not. But, you know, that's needs must as you approach an election.
The cap on bank bonuses was brought in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, and that was the right thing to do to rebuild the public finances. But that has gone now, and we don't have any intention of bringing that back.
Is this a Brexit bonus? Now, I absolutely hate this phrase because, you know, frankly, I'm not a big fan of Brexit, if you didn't already know that. But it is true that by being outside the EU, we have been able to get rid of this restriction that affects one of our most important industries, financial services. And it does have a difference at the margin. I said the bankers got around it, but certainly pay restrictions in countries like Amsterdam is one of the reasons why a lot of business hasn't left the City of London. So this is something we're only able to do outside the EU. But I have to say, it's pretty much the only example. It's certainly the most obvious and well-known example when I guess we were promised by the Brexiteers that there would be many, many examples of Britain, you know, reducing European red tape, getting out of European rules, becoming more competitive. They talked about, didn't they, building a Singapore on the Thames, i.e. a kind of lightly regulated, low tax, highly competitive economy, which in fact, it's a bit of a parody because that's not what Singapore is really like. But nevertheless, that's what we were promised. And all we've got at the end of it is a political consensus that bankers should be paid more.
Well, you can absolutely be sure that Rachel Reeves is not going to be labelling her decision not to restore the bank bonus caps as a Brexit dividend. That isn't not going to be her motivation. We are finally liberated from the common agricultural policy, and what we then have to put in place instead is a hugely expensive, complicated way of subsidising British farmers who are very upset about the free trade agreement struck with Australia and New Zealand because of the flow of cheap food from those places, which undermines, you know, our producers. And the last thing they want is the same thing happening from Canada and America. So, you know, it's a producer interest. It's expensive. The consumer's paying knowingly. I mean, if you had a vote, I think, as to whether people want to lower food standards, I think they'd vote against it.
Well, particularly if you put it like that. I feel we should go back to the days when my fellow Remainer, Liz Truss, was boasting of the virtues of exporting British agricultural products like pork to Beijing and, of course, cheese. In fact, this whole item is really so that we could play this clip, isn't it?
Let's play it.
I want to see us eating more British food here in Britain. At the moment, we import 2/3 of all of our apples. We import 9/10 of all of our pears. We import 2/3 of our cheese. That is a disgrace.
The audience isn't quite sure whether to clap that because they're not quite sure.
Liz went on to be Prime Minister.
She did.
Remember, this was supposed to be a big advocate for free trade, Brexit. We're actually having more controls on trade that are going to put the price of food up. And that's coming in this week, and it's going to be introduced over the coming months. And, you know, when Andrea Leadsom, and, you know, Andrea Leadsom and I used to work in the Treasury, so I got plenty of respect for her, but I disagreed with her on Brexit. And I have to say I did chuckle a bit when I heard her this week trying to explain that Brexit came at a price, which I don't remember her or her colleagues saying in 2016.
We also have huge trading arrangements with other countries around the world. I think 70 free trade deals that we've signed up to, including being the first European signatory to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, from where potentially up to half the world's growth is going to come in the next few decades. So there's a huge new opportunity for the UK at the same time as continuing to trade, albeit with some friction, which is the price you pay for leaving the single market and for being a sovereign state again.
So there's a leading Brexiteer now saying that, of course, there's an economic cost to Brexit, but there may have been a benefit in terms of Britain having its, as she would put it, her sovereignty back. But it now comes at an economic price, and the economic price is a very real one. It's going to increase the cost of food, and it's going to add to inflation, and that is just one of numerous obstacles now to trade. Brexit was the biggest act of protectionism in modern British history, not an act of free trade. And you're also seeing the repercussions of that elsewhere, all those talk of free trade deals. Look, we've just heard that the Canadian free trade deal is not happening. That's not a benefit we're foregoing. That's actually something that's going to cost us, because British farmers and cheesemakers, for example, aren't going to be able to sell to Canada anymore.
Yeah, but the reason it's not happening is because the British government know that British voters won't accept meat from Canada coming in with lower standards. And the same thing applies. Why can't we have a free trade agreement with America? That was also promised, a bilateral deal. The reason is because the advantage for Britain would be to open our financial services industry to American markets. The Americans are not interested in that. The advantage for the Americans would be to sell cheaper American food into the UK. The British government knows that British people, including people who voted Brexit, don't want cheaper American food with lower standards. So the idea that free trade agreements would be easy to negotiate, well, it turns out they're not, because people don't want the deregulation.
This is, of course, all in the week where we've had another Northern Ireland agreement post-Brexit. I mean, it remains one of the great mysteries how the unionist parties, the DUP, supported Brexit when it's probably done more for Irish unification than anything else in the last 100 years.
And certainly increased the regulatory burden for the Irish economy.
Right. And here's another, we've got another agreement this week, and credit to the government for negotiating this, because it's not easy, which is going to lead to a Sinn Féin First Minister in Northern Ireland. If you think back to when we were children, the idea that you'd have a Sinn Féin minister and First Minister of Northern Ireland would have seemed absolutely extraordinary.
When I was at university, or just after, the BBC were banned from interviewing any Sinn Féin politician on the television. I mean, because they were a terrorist organisation.
And now we're going to have the Sinn Féin First Minister.
Massive change.
Yes, and I think Brexit has accelerated these developments in Northern Ireland. But we are now, as a result, part of the way that deal's done is that in order not to have a border, as people would put it, in the Irish Sea between Northern Ireland and the UK, the rest of the UK, we've basically made a promise not to diverge very much from European regulation, so that there's not also a border on the Irish border with the Republic. And it does seem to me we have ended up with the kind of worst of both worlds. We're sticking with these EU rules because of things like the Northern Ireland situation, and because there's no appetite for a big act of deregulation. And at the same time, there's a load more paperwork, checks and costs to make sure we're complying with all those rules, hence the new costs that are coming in on food imports from the EU. So we have got absolutely zero benefits from Brexit. You can make a trade case for Brexit. You can make an economic case for Brexit if you were to pursue a really decisive economic policy, which is we're going to be lower tax, lower regulation in the European continent. We're going to be hyper competitive. We don't mind if that shuts us out of some European business. We're going to strike these free trade deals with the United States and Canada because we're going to take in their beef and we're going to sell them their cheese and the like.
And our farmers can go by the wayside. That's okay.
Yeah, and we have done none of that.
No.
And as a result, happy Brexit Day, as the Conservative Party reminded me this week in my inbox, has come and gone. And we've marked it simply by £300 million more costs on British consumers for the food they eat.
Because the interesting thing which has happened since Brexit is that we are now stopping international tourists from reclaiming their VAT. There's a big Daily Mail campaign about this, the tourist tax. This is something where once we left the European Union and we weren't part of an agreement where you had to offer these concessions, the British government has decided to increase VAT on international tourists. So it's actually used the Brexit discretion to do something which is now seen to be harming British business and retailers.
I think, to be fair, Rishi Sunak was Chancellor at the time.
Was he?
The reason they
The Brexiteer Rishi Sunak.
the Brexit voting Rishi Sunak. He did not maintain the EU's scheme, which was that you got VAT off if you bought a Gucci handbag or a Chanel dress or whatever in London if you were a Chinese tourist or an American tourist. So the reason was because once we left the EU, you'd have to give that VAT rebate to European citizens as well. You have to give it to French people, German people, and so on. And it was going to be hugely expensive for the Treasury, a couple of £1 billion a year from memory. But of course, here's another irony. We were told during the Brexit campaign that we'd have lower VAT if we left the EU because we'd have freedom to reduce our rates. And that was actually one of the most popular messages of the Brexit campaign. They were going to reduce VAT on things like heating and the like.
I mean, you can see the problem for Jeremy Hunt, for Rishi Sunak, because were you to reduce this tourist tax at a time when most people's budgets are under pressure, you'd have a very expensive tax cut, which mainly goes to rich Chinese, rich Americans, rich Arabs,
and Monsieur Arnaud, who owns all the shops
people who can
they shop
afford
at.
People who can afford to come and buy luxury goods in London, then fly home.
Yeah, but there's quite an ecosystem around. I mean, the argument is there's a whole set of hotels, restaurants, transport. The centre of London thrives on this business.
All I'm saying is,
and other places
you
like
wouldn't
Bicester Village, Edinburgh, other places as well.
All I'm saying, it's not an easy communication for any chancellor to say our priority for tax cuts is visiting wealthy Chinese. But the broader point is really interesting, isn't it? Because they haven't really taken advantage of the flexibility to reshape the whole VAT system. They could have had a wholly different system. They could. For years we were constrained. Now we're not. Almost nothing's happened.